reading more Hegel. I've kind of been neglecting to do that, even though I know I should do that. I feel that the two aspects of Marxism that I, in terms of theory, that I need to understand better when speaking about old school Marxism. There's the theory of alienation, and then there's some aspects of dialectics. And the reason is that both of those are very Hegelian ideas, used in a totally new way by Marx, but still there's a lot of Hegelian baggage there. I understand them pretty well, but I think there's a couple of things that I don't really truly understand. But speaking about dialectics, I thought that I would just maybe explain a few things that I feel that a lot of people get wrong when they're thinking about dialectics or talking about dialectics, because I made a couple of videos about dialectics a while back, and I was supposed to make one more video, and I never really did because I wanted to do more research. So I think I should just address a couple of those things. Back then I was in this debate, sort of a back and forth with this person, this Trotskyist, who had pretty much devoted most of their free time apparently into debunking dialectics and every aspect of dialectics. Now, I don't think they actually, debunked it or anything, but I sort of...
By the way, it's Rosa Lichtenstein.
Yeah, he's definitely talking about Rosa Lichtenstein.
Ended up getting out of that discussion because it just wasn't going anywhere. We didn't agree on anything. We didn't even agree on the premises of most things, but that kind of gave me a lot of good examples of how people can misunderstand dialectics. So it has a lot to do with language. For example, when we're thinking about things turning into their opposites, this is where language becomes a problem, because people think that opposites are like men and women, left and right, hands and feet, black and white, or maybe red and blue. I mean, just sort of depends on the language, depends on the person you ask, cats and dogs. But none of those things are really opposites when, in the dialectical sense. They might...
Actually, they are. They're very opposite in the dialectical sense. For reasons, obviously, that people don't generally realize, but
yeah,
they are definitely opposite. One of the technicalities people might want to say is contraries, that these are contraries as opposed to, dialectical opposites. Same thing.
Be opposites in, like, cats and dogs. Are they really opposite to each other?
Okay, well, cats and dogs aren't opposites, but their owners sure are. Completely opposite characters.
They're in every possible way. I mean, not really. There's actually a lot of similarities. They're both animals. They're both mammals. They're both domesticated. It's just a language thing. It's a cultural thing. When things turn into their opposites, does that mean that men turn into women? Of course not. Or cats turn into dogs? Of course not. A famous example, when workers take over, they go from the exploited class to the ruling class. Now, do they become exploiters themselves because they go from exploited to rulers? So wouldn't they become exploiters themselves? No, because in that case, there's also of course, the negation of the negation, which was a very key idea to Marxist dialectics. And
I don't know, man. I'd say I disagree there. This guy clearly has not heard of self-exploitation. It's one of the key planks of left communism.
Even to Hegelian dialectics, that there's always this progress that happens, that each step is higher than the previous one. So we go from primitive communism to a technologically more and scientifically more advanced society, which is primitive agriculture, primitive, cattle raising, primitive private property, and then to slavery, feudalism, capitalism, and finally back to modern communism. So all the way from primitive communism go back to modern communism. But even though it goes back to communism, it's still vastly different. because primitive communism is a much lower stage historically than modern communism, and it's historically a lower stage than capitalism or slave society. Then somebody brought up that I believe in some.
I always find that example to be confused. What do you think, Hyperion?
Yeah, a bit.
I mean, in that whole discussion, I kind of lost track of what he even started. What did he start discussing?
Yeah, I find it so difficult to focus on lots of these YouTube people. Like, not the best writers.
Yeah, what was it that he started with? Like, seriously, I can't remember. Because it wasn't about this.
I think it's like applying, like, trying to, hey,
oh yeah, he was talking
going
about
off
the
that negation of the negation point. Yeah.
He started with talking about what opposition is. We have certain notions of opposition which are contraries, which aren't really contraries. He talked about language there. He says it's a trick of language. Well, it's not a trick of language. It's actually a trick. It's not even a trick. It's just a cultural thing. So for like the cats and dogs things. Yeah, cats and dogs are different. What's the opposition? It's obviously not that they're animal form or blah blah. He said they obviously have things in common that nothing to do with dialectics, by the way. Which in dialectics, the weird thing is things can only be opposed because they are common. They have an identical aspect to them. So that's definitely not something against anybody making a comparison of that sort. But on the cats and dogs things, he said about language. It's not about language. It's really about culture. We notice we conceptualize things a certain way. Cats are for assholes and people who don't like to take care of their animals. They just want a lazy animal that just takes care of itself. All you do for a cat is just like put it outside, put a bowl of food, and the cat will go around catting. As opposed to a dog, which most of the time they're dumb and stupid and they want to spend time with you.
But they're comrades. They love you.
Yeah, and they love you. Unlike cats. Cats are cats are assholes. I have a fat cat here. I have a fat cat here, and I have a sleek, slim cat. They're twins.
Yeah.
They're both assholes. Like one of the fat ones just lets you do a lot more with it because it's fat, and so it's too lazy to even attack you.
Yeah. My sister's cat is dog-like in some ways, but he also has autism or something.
Of course, it's not a proper cat.
Yeah.
There's something wrong with it. It's not what it should be. It does not live up to its concept.
Yeah. Or maybe it surpasses it. Who knows?
But anyways, I mean, that kind of external application, you can make the contraries, by the way. I mean, simply you can make the contrary of the characters of a cat or dog, and yeah, it's a real contrary. It's a real dialectic. Whoop-de-doo.
Yeah. We should note that this video is 2 years old. But so...
Oh, yeah.
And he hasn't posted anything recently about dialectic, so we don't know what he knows
dialectical
now.
Materialism.
Oh, is it more recent?
It's more recent, I think. It's probably not recent. More than a year old, too, I think. We might check that out.
Some text, I don't remember which one, but Mao actually says that he didn't really agree with the negation of the negation, that he didn't believe it actually exists, that there's only the law of contradiction and probably the unity of contradiction. And they were like, haha, you see, like Mao, it didn't even agree with dialectics, and it's a core idea of dialectics. Well, I think that's more of just a thing about definitions. Like, the whole idea of the negation of the negation is that, why is it the negation of the negation? Why is it just not negation? Because a lot of times Mao would say that, okay, this is the new synthesis, this is the new negation, this is the new synthesis and new negation. So, of course, there's the first synthesis, whatever it is, then there's the first negation, and then there's the next synthesis, which is the negation of the negation. But you don't necessarily have to call it negation of the negation. I mean, you could call it okay, we got the synthesis, then we got the negation, then we got the negation of the negation, then we got the negation of the negation of the negation, and then we got the negation of the negation of the negation of the negation. It's, So I don't think he actually just totally dismissed the idea, the concept of the negation of the negation. I mean, he just maybe he thought about it differently. Maybe he just didn't like the language, but he uses the negation of the negation all the time. So, in my opinion, he probably just meant that it maybe doesn't qualify as a law, like a law of nature, a law of dialectics, because really.
All right. So let's negate this chain of negations right here.
Sure.
That was a very oddly organized string of sentences.
So anyways, well, I guess we'll talk about it. The whole issue of the negation is, and maybe he understands this now, but he clearly doesn't understand what the issue is. In which the difference between these Maoists who deny this the negation is they at least have a grasp that the negation is supposed to be this kind of return to unity. The sublation is a reconciliation of contradictions. So when Mao denies that there is no negation, he's basically denying that there is a return to unity of any kind. And that it's just one dialectic to the next dialectic, and there is no moment of unity from dialectic to dialectic. It's a jump. You just start with one dialectic that resolves itself. Immediately there's another dialectic. Yes, that's how it happens in Hegel, but Mao's just kind of denying that there is any sublating moment there. Of course, then he can't really explain why there would be an arising of a new dialectic, but he's probably not thinking about it in any sense of which, Hegel or Marx thinks about it.
I think the idea with Mao is that contradictions kind of depend on other contradictions, and there's kind of like a meta contradiction that and is kind of like has some sort of superiority relation with each other and antagonisms with each other. But I do think that it's pretty true that they do have that denial of a sublation moment. It's kind of the focus is a lot on meta contradiction almost.
Yeah, I know for a fact. What was it? Althusser also has this notion, in which it's what is it? What's the Freudian term he uses? Overdetermination.
Yeah.
And the idea is that there is a plurality of contradictions going on at any time, like basically on a sort of a flat field. But within that flat field, there's also a sort of like a range of nested contradictions within the contradictions as well. So you can talk about the dominant or the prominent contradiction at any one moment. So one moment, the dominant contradiction or the primary contradiction is imperialism, or the next one it's environmentalism, or the contradiction between human technology and environment or nature, blah blah blah. It changes, and that's not wrong in itself. I mean, it makes sense. Obviously, there's things that have more importance at any given one time, which are more important to deal with, to reconcile, to work out. But definitely what it misses out is the idea of sublation, the idea that there's a unity. And the way this would work is that, let me just give the full explanation. So he was talking about syntheses for a little moment there, and he's wrong because, for example, classical example you'll almost hear everywhere, being, nothing, becoming. It's actually not as simple as it sounds, but it is quite simple. So, you start with a position, being, immediacy. The next position is not a synthesis. It is just, the content of being. It's nothing. From that, you get what normally would call a synthesis, which people term it as synthesis. It's not a good word for it, but fine, let's go with it for now. It's becoming. Well, how is it that becoming is a unity of contradictions? Well, it's because being becomes nothing, nothing becomes being. Becoming is this shift from being to nothing and nothing to being. So that's a unity. Being is a unity with nothing. Being is its becoming to nothing. Nothing is its becoming to being. And so here, here you kind of lose track of, you know, where the hell Mao is coming from, because it's clearly not coming from any of this notion of the Hegelian dialectic or the Marxist dialectic, because you need this moment of unity in order to have something that's different and new to contradict something else. And as a matter of fact, here in Becoming, the contradiction is not of becoming against something else. Actually, it's the contradiction of becoming against itself. So self-oppositions do happen. That is a legitimate contradiction. It's totally dialectical. Mao definitely did not know what the hell he was talking about. He had some good points, but definitely doesn't quite make sense. But anyways, sorry about that. To cash out on what I was saying, which was about the negation. You have being, you have nothing. Nothing negates being. What is the return of what is the movement of negation? What's the return back to being? But this time it's being, which includes nothing, because you find out, oh, being's content is nothing. It's part of being. So you can do that basic negation, in which you return to the same thing, more concretized. There's also a negation, in which you also have this new term arise. But that's a whole different character, which I won't bother explaining here. But let's keep going.
Yeah.
Really, there's just the unity of opposites and the quality turning into quantity and vice versa, quantity turning into quality. But then the big thing is the idea of self-motion. That's something that was brought up on multiple occasions. So the difficult thing about the idea of self-motion of matter, or self-motion in general, is that Lenin didn't really extensively talk about it. Nobody really did. I don't remember if Marx ever talked about it, but Lenin talked about it in one or two things. I think in his commentary on Hegel, and then maybe some other stuff. But
Hegel definitely talked about it.
Yeah, I was gonna say there's one person who talked about it.
none of those things were ever published, and I don't think they were even finished. But it's just some notes that he wrote, basically. So that's why it's not necessarily all too clear what he meant. But the idea of self-motion is a Hegelian concept, and when I was in that back and forth with the Trotskyists who didn't like dialectics, I think they had this joke on their site which was like, how many dialecticians does it take to turn a light bulb, or like a switch light bulb, and it said none, because the light bulb switches itself or replaces itself, and that's okay, it's kind of clever, but it's also really stupid. Now, what does that joke mean? It means that if matter is in self-motion, everything just does things by itself. You don't need anything else. Now, there's really two aspects of that. The main idea is that in dialectics, the reason for change and for development are contradictions in the thing itself, inside the thing in itself. So it's not caused by external forces mainly. It's mainly caused by the thing's internal contradictions. Now, we got into this debate about whether or not external contradictions are or external forces are a factor, because I said that, well, obviously external forces are a factor, but they said that, no, this idea of external forces is like a Stalinist invention that was invented to fix the otherwise ridiculous theory, and I was like, okay, whatever. But if you just read the Dialectics of Nature by Engels, it talks about how like a seed of grain can grow into a plant, crops, if it is in the proper conditions. If there's like light and moisture and heat, then it can grow. So obviously he's talking about external contradictions, but the primary reason why the thing grows is the internal contradictions of it. I believe it was Mao who said that the best way to understand this is that if you take an egg and you apply heat, then it hatches into a chicken. But if you take a stone, or like an egg-shaped stone, and you apply heat, then it never hatches into a chicken. I
don't know, man. If I take an egg and apply heat, I usually get an omelet.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. But also, this point.
Okay, so he completely glossed over and skipped about the whole motion thing, even though it's actually very interesting. And I wouldn't go to Engel's Dialectics of Nature for this at all. I'd actually go to Hegel's Philosophy of Nature. As a matter of fact, he talks about it in the Logic as well. And it's not about self-motion. It's actually about just the concept of motion itself and how... And it goes all the way back to an ancient problem, one of the problems which was Zeno's paradox. One of Zeno's paradox of motion was that logically speaking, from the standpoint of normal logic, formal logic, motion is something that we can't actually speak logically. You know, any set of propositions in which we try to describe what motion is, we've already assumed motion has happened, and we're only talking about these moments of motion in which motion has already finished. So, you know, you have point A, you know, you have point B, you know, they're apart from each other, and you say, okay, this thing was at point A, you know, at this time, and then it's at point B at this other time. It has moved. And so we think, oh, well, it obviously has moved. And the paradox is basically about, but how did it move? You know, how is motion possible? You know, how can you even think motion? You know, we only ever think and see things in the respective frozen positions at any one moment. The whole idea of motion seems to be a thing that is of illusion. Obviously, it wasn't an illusion, but the problem was, how do we actually think this, as opposed to just say it happens and have no idea how it actually could happen. And just to wrap that piece up, Hegel actually does mention that the main contradiction here is that things which are in motion literally have to be thought of as being in the same place and not the same place at the same time. Because whether you think about it as a continuum or whether you think about it as a quantum, it doesn't fucking matter. The thing has to be in two places at once. So, you know, you're moving from point A to point B. Well, you got to be at point A and point B at the same time. But there's a lot more to say about that. Anything else to say about that? Or to what he said up there?
No. Okay, I was trying to think about what he was just talking about, because he glossed over motion. I knew you were going to answer that.
Oh yeah, he was talking about self-development. He's talking about self-motion, but what he's actually talking about is not motion at all. It's called the self-development here, you know, self-determination. Yeah. So he gives the plant of the egg becoming. Yeah, he like gives the example.
The egg becomes more of what it is when you apply heat to it. Well, you know, the right amount that won't allow it to burn or crack or whatever. But a rock doesn't do that, and that's his point. I don't know what point Mao is making there, but
yeah. Well, I mean, he's making in this point of self-movement, but it's a wrong way to phrase it. It's the wrong categories. Movement is not what is being talked about here. It's development.
Yeah.
So, you know, when he gives the example of, like, Engels gives this, and Engels takes this from Hegel because Hegel's the one who gives it, but the seed becoming a plant or tree or blah blah blah. Yeah. What is being talked about there is self-development. You know, yes, there are conditions which are necessary for the actuality of this development to really happen. You need the soil, you need the sun, you need water, and then the seed will grow. The point to be there is not that this is like an absolute self-development, but rather that the self-development of the plant as plant has nothing to do with these other factors. You know, these other factors are external to it. He's talking about external contradictions, which they're not really contradictions in any sense that anybody really talks about them. Because, you know, there's no contradiction between the plant and the sun. There's no contradiction between the plant and the soil. There's no contradiction between the plant and the water. One could oppose them, sure, you know, in abstraction. You know, say, well, you know, the plant's not dirt, or the dirt's not plant, but who cares? So, just wrapping that one up, the point here is self-development, and that self-development of things as themselves is something intrinsic, immanent to them. within them. You know, the principle of development of the plant is wholly within the plant. It doesn't come from the sun, doesn't come from the dirt. It comes from the plant itself. And what is a plant? You know, it originates as a seed. The seed has its principle of development, which is its DNA, which has, you know, the entire biological structure in which, you know, whatever it is, people don't like the word plan, but, you know, it's kind of a fitting. It's a teleological thing. It has an internal purpose already set. You know, the DNA
it has
means
potentiality
things.
within it.
Yeah, it has potentiality. So, you know, the DNA already has set, you know, the possibility of what the plant actually is and what it does. So that's how a plant becomes a plant, and that's also how an egg becomes a chicken. Or a turtle or something.
And that's how a stone does not become anything else other than what it is. Because it's reached its final conclusion.
Yeah, stones don't have any principles of development. They don't grow, they're not living, and that's
they're
one of the
not
things
living.
that that's one of the key things. Hegel's logic actually applies most strongly to living things. It's an organic logic. So the principles of self-development don't appear to make sense to us if we're talking about metaphysical ideas, or if we're talking about, you know, just matter and nature. That doesn't seem to have any self-development, but we know that living things definitely do. So let's continue.
All right.
All that happens is it might break or melt or something, because the nature of the thing in itself is different. So the real reason for its changes are the thing's internal nature, internal makeup, and those limit what it can actually do. And that also applies to when we're talking about what is an opposite of what. Because there's all these difficulties that arise from language when you think about, like, the opposite of man is alien, so therefore men become aliens or space aliens or something. No.
I don't know, man. Who was it that said that man is alienated from himself?
Oh.
I think that was Marx.
Yeah, it was Marx, but I thought you were going to say...
Yeah,
I thought you were going to say...
But come on, man. The singularity...
Who's that man that said... Yeah.
The singularity's coming. We're going to be all little green men.
Yeah, that's what I thought you were going to say. Who is it that... I was trying to think of who said that, you know, man could be... Or aliens could be future man. That's what I was trying to think of, and then you tripped me up with the Marx joke.
But yeah. Man is alien to himself, but that's just joking around.
Yeah.
The way you actually know what the actual opposite is, and not just what, you know, your cultural background might make you think is considered the opposite of something, it depends on the actual nature of the thing. Because dialectics is not magic. I mean, it would be magic if people just turned into animals or into space aliens or something.
That's where he's wrong.
Oh, he's very wrong. It absolutely is magic.
Yeah, it's sorcery.
Definitely. I mean, just do one dialectic and, like, you realize, wait, what the hell just happened? And you look back, it's like, whoa, that happened. I didn't intend that. It just is. Every time you get some movement, you're like, oh, well, it just is. Where did it come from? Magic. I mean, actually, like, literally, that's... in the book, Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition, it definitely has a few sections which are just wonderful for showing just, like, how the everydayness of magic is, and why magic originally, the idea of the incantation, the idea of, you know, like the mantra, the idea of that there is this sort of, like, form of language which you know, in which magic must be spoken, whether it is, you know, a physiological language like physical movements, or a spoken language. Either way, it's language. And so words are literally magic, and they've always been considered magical for pretty much since ever. But that's just some etymology stuff and history.
Yeah, that's mumbo
things'
jumbo.
own nature and own internal factors determine what it actually becomes. But getting back to the idea of self-motion,
Well, anyways, otherwise than that, he was correct about that. That the way you really get to know what the opposite of a thing is by at least conception, as the concept of the thing, you develop the concept and you realize that's how you get to the opposite. It's not a pre-chosen thing. It's not a pre-given thing. It's not like light and darkness in which, you just kind of assume it because it seems to be the case. There really is a principle from within in which you've got to work that out. Often it's not something you really have to consciously do. It just happens. It just so happens that nothing is the opposite of being. Really, the most important thing to note about that is, and that he hasn't mentioned, in which people should be aware of, is the reason it's called opposition is the whole opposition and contradiction thing. The word opposition has nothing to do with what people normally think when they're asked, think the opposite of something, which is the extreme other, which is essentially different. And in normal language, that's easy to do. In normal examples, that's easy to do because things are just already given to you experience. Things are already opposed. But opposition, fundamentally, in the philosophical sense, has nothing to do with that. It's more just to be thought of in the sense of literally things being put up against each other. That's what opposition is. So the opposition of being and nothing is not this presumption of, this extreme antithesis. But rather it's just that. It's an opposition, being put against. It just so happens that it happens to very often go very much with our sense of what these extreme oppositions are.
Yeah.
But that's mainly to do with how Hegel takes words from the common language to fit the structures that he's talking about. And these structures are opposed, but they're opposed primarily by their own structure and as well as a sort of intention which these structures play in our everyday lives. So, for example, in the opposition of finitude to finitude, the reality is that finitude to infinitude. The reality is not that of finitude to infinitude. It actually is of finitude to finitude. But it's still also an apt way and a correct way in which Hegel uses it, that normally what we mean by infinitude is exactly a finite thing. So it works out.
That's very complicated. We shouldn't get into that right now.
Yeah, it gets complicated, but it actually works out. So the opposition is both the extreme opposition you think it is, but it's also not the extreme opposition you think it is.
I think to say that self-motion means that a light bulb can replace itself, that's a fundamental misunderstanding of the concept, because it assumes that the light bulb exists in a vacuum. Because the biggest thing about dialectics is that everything is interconnected. Everything affects everything. Not in any kind of weird New Age magic kind of way, but just because of various forces, like gravity, for example. Things have gravity that impacts other things around them. Things, you do something to somebody else, they react to that, you react to how they react to that, and it's basically just trying to push this idea that things don't necessarily exist in a linear cause and effect line of interaction. It's not that there's cause and then there's the effect. No, according to dialectics, it's more.
Now, I don't know if he's read Bertil Ohlmann, but that line of reasoning actually comes. Where I found it most strongly was in Bertil Ohlmann's stuff, and a lot of people parrot it. It's nice. It's not wrong, but it's not completely right either. The only response he should have given to that is, well, obviously the only reason that a light bulb doesn't screw itself in is because a light bulb isn't alive. It's not a self-moving thing by principle. So, of course, the idea of this, or what he calls self-motion here, but it's really self-development. The reason it doesn't apply is because, well, it's not the kind of thing to which it applies to. It has nothing to do with, there's conditions of external conditions which have to be taken into account. No. It's simply the thing doesn't move itself. Here it is indeed the case. Here it is indeed the case that the criticism was right. That obviously light bulbs don't light themselves, don't move themselves, don't screw themselves in, don't make themselves, but living things do. And so the example he was given here, the whole thing about the conditions, it undermines his own point. You know, he's trying to give this, he's trying to defend this point about self-movement, self-development, but he's undermining it by saying, oh yes, but there's conditions which, you know, are actually factors in the self-development of things which are external to them.
More like the two things both have effects on each other and cause changes in each other, and then those changes cause different kinds of changes and different kinds of causes in a way. So it's just trying to go against this idea, this very simplistic idea that, okay, there's one cause, then there's an effect, and then there's another cause, another effect. No, it's more like a, you know, a dialectical relation between two objects. But what exactly is self-motion? Well, self-motion is a Hegelian concept, and I really should get back to reading more Hegel, trying to understand it a little bit better.
Yes, you should. You should ask me for help too.
And it's difficult because of the language, but it's also difficult just because the concepts themselves are difficult, and because it's idealism. To me, idealism is a lot more difficult to understand than materialism, because it's so abstract and it's so, you know, it's not concrete at all. It's so theoretical. But basically,
yeah, I knew you were gonna stop there.
I'd completely disagree, by the way.
Yeah.
Believe you me, it took me almost 4 years, like it took me about 2 years to finally come to the grips of understanding and realizing for myself that Marxist materialism is not materialism. Like, it actually doesn't mean anything. And if anybody, like, you know, is honest about it, they realize that there's nothing to it. You know, he calls it materialism. It has nothing to do with materialism. Marxist materialism would actually be just simply called monism, in this sense. You know, this whole idea of the interrelation of things, you know, the idea that everything is subsumed within material. It's nothing but when you have no opposition to the material and everything is material, you don't have materialism anymore.
Yeah.
Not only that, Marx wasn't talking about any substance either. So, you know, he didn't care about the actual idea of matter so much as what he cared about, what he termed with the material relations of things, which is simply just that, the relations of things, whether they are ideal or material in the usual like sense. So when everything like that just gets subsumed under materialism, you're not talking about materialism of any kind anymore. Which is why people like who are the more philosophical Marxists, they're right to point out that Marx's great interest in life ultimately was only in his conception of historical materialism, which has nothing to do with metaphysical materialism, and it's actually more of a sort of a pseudo-empirical thesis in which there's good empirical ground for it and there's also good rational ground for it. But it has nothing to do really with this idea of materialism. And when you get into Hegel's idealism, yeah, it's daunting at the beginning, but if you really want to learn about it, it's a lot quicker, because unlike Marx, Hegel actually tells you what he meant. So with Marx, you get running circles, and you got to read the young Marx and the middle Marx and the old Marx, and you have all these people commenting between, was there a break, was there not? You know, did he abandon this? Did he abandon that? You know, did he change his mind? And with Hegel, it's like, no, Hegel knew what was up when he first started the system. By the time he gets the phenomenology written, there is no question for him anymore. He knows exactly what he's doing, and he works through everything upon that same basis. So it's actually quite simple, and it's actually very concrete. Read the phenomenology. If that's not concrete, I don't know what is. Here I think the mistake is thinking that concretion has to do with things which you find easily graspable. And
yeah,
because there are things that you think are concrete, and it's like, oh, look at the dialectic between the rock and the plant. Well, that you may think that's concrete, but actually that's abstract. It's not very detailed. It's not conceptually rigorous. It seems easy to grasp because, well, there's not much to grasp there to begin with.
To me, to say that self-motion means that things that exist in a vacuum change themselves, that's totally wrong, because with Hegel, the whole idea was that Hegel's idea, or Geist, which he basically thought was God, it was his God, and his view on God was that God is like infinite, that it includes everything, you know, because he kind of thought that if God is not infinite, if everything is not included in him, then is he really God? If he, you know, it just can't be just some big dude on a cloud. It has to be this thing that encompasses everything. So basically, the self-motion of the idea means that, I mean, because to him, the idea is the thing that exists first, because he's an idealist. So it's the self-motion of the idea. But if
No. That's a misconception. It's a common misconception. Hegel is not an idealist in this sense. He's not Plato. And even Plato, depending on who you read, who's commenting on Plato, even Plato wasn't Plato in that sense either. The whole thing about the idea and idealism here has more to do with the principle of intelligibility, meaning the things which allows you to know. So the idea is logically prior as a thing which can be known first as itself and through which everything else is known. So, for example, the system of science. You know, Hegel calls what he's doing science. Of course, most people don't agree, but most people don't know what science is anyway.
Yeah, he's talking about Wissenschaft, which is knowledge.
Yeah, so when he's talking about the whole thing about the absolute idea, well, what's the absolute idea? It's the idea that knows itself as idea. Meaning, it's really the thought within your mind which finally grasps exactly what thinking a thought is. It's a self-thinking thought. So once you have this, and it's also the knowledge of what a thinking or an idea is. So once you have the general structure of what an idea is, then you can know pretty much everything, because you know everything else through ideas. So if you didn't know what an idea was, you didn't know how it is that you actually knew things, and you couldn't explain it, which is a deep philosophical problem. People are still losing their minds over it. Most people don't care. But hey. So the only thing that has a priority here as it's not a temporal thing. It's not that first the idea existed as God, and then it said let there be light or whatever, and then there was a universe. No, it was simply, well, it's the first principle of intelligibility. It's the first knowable thing that can know itself. An idea, because we think in ideas, we can know an idea that knows what an idea is, and then we know everything else. But as temporally speaking, spatially speaking, everything has been the way it is on a metaphysical level. It's probably too high a word. I don't know how else to phrase it.
Yeah, to phrase.
I'm basically the structure of the world, as material or as individual, as concrete, has always been immediately this way already. There has been no temporal gap between there first was this abstract idea and then there was the concrete world made out of it. No, the Hegel says it himself, there are no such things as abstract ideas. As a matter of fact, ideas, universals, what have you, concepts, they've already always been embodied. Like, they've always already been individuals.
If we think about it in terms of materialism, like the self-motion of matter, then I think the best way to understand what Hegel really meant is that he was an idealist, but if you took it to materialism, just look at the world. The world is entirely matter. Like, if somebody was to say that there's just self-motion of matter and energy, and in a way energy is also matter, so, in a different state, but okay, so it's...
No. This isn't just coming from a philosophical standpoint, by the way. This is from a physical standpoint, from literally empirical science. And this is an interesting example, actually, about how Hegel, how the way we think literally ends up being very Hegelian. And that is that what's that famous equation? E equals mc squared, energy is matter moving at the speed of light squared. Originally, the concept of energy, in a basic sense, the modern physical sense, comes about as what? Looking at matter in motion. And yet, it's around the time of Einstein that suddenly there's an inversion between the primacy of matter and suddenly the belief that energy is somehow this weird thing that underlies matter, which isn't matter, but which matter embodies. And it makes perfect sense because of the way we have to like work with it. You know, with equations, you have to treat energy as if it really is a thing. Sorry about that dog noise. But anyways, conceptually speaking, energy underlies matter as the universal, which it's like value. It's like value in commodities, you know? Literally the same kind of thing. You have the supposedly real thing, but the whole movement and the way things works ends up being completely inverted in the way we see it and the way we understand it happening. So whereas, you know, in the market economy, you would think it'd be the actors, the persons, and the commodities which are making the commodities move. What we find is that what makes commodities move in an economic sense is value. And likewise, in a physical sense, what we find that things move, material objects move. The thing that we see moving is not material objects, but mathematically speaking, it's pure energy. What is it that transfers, you know, when an object hits another object? It's not matter. It's energy. How is this possible? It's movement. You know, how is this possible? Well, it's under the concept of energy. Conservation of energy, you know, weird other laws, blah, blah, blah. It's weird.
Basically, there's only matter. It's just self-motion of matter. How is that incorrect? You know,
I don't know. You know, the pink unicorn that I'm imagining in my mind is most definitely not matter. And if you think it is, then you don't have a definition of matter that matters. People just don't know that. I mean, it's just a quirk. Only philosophers seem to care about this, in which, like, the meaning of words matter, people, and the moment you make your word mean anything and everything, you don't have anything meaningful. Like, the word that you think is so meaningful doesn't mean a thing. Because if it means everything, then it has no actual definition. You know, to define things, it's to limit them, to put a bound to them so you know exactly what you're talking about. If you never know what exactly you're talking about when you're talking about matter, if by talking about matter I could just be talking about that pink unicorn in my head, or this experience of seeing, or, you know, the thing in front of me that's, like, you know, graspable. If all that's what matter can mean, well, you know, it makes language confused. You don't, you know, you say, well, that's material, you know, nobody knows what you're talking about.
it's not. It's correct. It's absolutely correct. So the idea of self-motion of matter doesn't mean that, okay, my coffee cup is just going to start moving around on its own. No, it means that matter itself is in constant self-motion without anything else doing anything. Similarly to Hegel's idea or spirit, however, you know, Geist, it's German. It kind of means like ghost or spirit or idea or mind.
Mind.
However you want to translate it. So that idea is in constant self-motion, and that causes everything. There's no other thing affecting it. It's the only thing that there is. So that's.
Well, see here, he's wrong about that. The idea doesn't cause anything.
At least that's at least how I.
Sorry about that. The idea doesn't cause anything. It's the same thing. Which is funny. He was talking about this earlier, in which, you know, you can't think about this as one-directional cause. The idea is the principle is indeed what he's talking about. You know, if you want to put it in motion terms, fine. The idea is indeed the very thing which allows the self-motion of everything. But within every single thing, that self-motion is unique to that thing. So, you know, and going back to what I was saying earlier, self-development. The self-development, the self-motion of a grain of rice or a rice plant is not the same at all as the self-motion of a dog. The self-development of a dog or a human being, or of the mind, or of thoughts. So we're not talking about this a reduction of everything to physical motion, which seems to be what he thinks it is. He wants to reduce everything. It's like, oh, it's just matter and motion. It can't be. If that was the case, we can't explain from that alone how living things are possible. We can't explain from that alone how chemistry is possible. From that alone, we get no explanation as to what gravity is. It's really an empty idea. It's easy to say, well, everything's matter. Everything's matter in motion. Much harder to give an actual account of what you're actually talking about in such a way that we can actually certify and know that you're talking about a valid absolute here. Because what he's talking about is the absolute. He's saying basically matter is the absolute, as opposed to Hegel, where the idea is the absolute. And for Hegel, well, there's no absolute as such in any individual thing. The idea is not really absolute. Neither is nature, neither is a rock, neither is a chicken, and neither are we.
I understand self-motion, but that's still something that I'm trying to learn. Let's see, was there anything else? I guess one last correction. It's about the unity of opposites again. People seem to get this wrong quite often, and especially people who are critical of dialectics, they don't seem to understand this part of dialectics. They don't understand that when there's a revolution, they say that the workers become the rulers, but they don't understand that the workers themselves, it's not a change within the worker themselves, it's a change in the society, because the workers and capitalists they're the opposites that exist in a unity of opposites. It's a pair of opposites. And then when those two things create a new synthesis, that is the new society. So, the old society encompasses capitalists and workers, who are the opposites. They're the contradictions within that system. When that contradiction resolves itself, it resolves itself by the system changing into a new system. Not that the capitalist himself changes into a dog or something, or the worker himself changes into a capitalist. No, the system changes. And then that system has new contradictions in it. So the workers become the ruling class, but they don't become the exact same ruling class that existed before in the old system. Similarly, the capitalists become the oppressed class, but they don't become the same oppressed class that existed before. So basically, how do you avoid this mistake? You avoid this mistake by understanding that when there's contradictions in something, then that thing itself changes. But when there's contradictions between some two things, then that doesn't mean that either of those things change. Like if there's contradictions between workers and capitalists, that means that the system they live in will change, because that is basically contradictions in the system. But if there's contradictions within the worker somehow, then that causes the worker himself to change. But the contradiction between workers and capitalists don't cause, that they don't make the worker himself change and the society not change. And the only thing that really happens to the worker is that his position in that society is different, because the society itself is different.
I don't know.
Hello?
Hey.
When did I DC?
Like 13 minutes.
Jesus Christ, I've been talking this entire time.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, at least I got it recorded.
Yeah. Yeah, Kwame and I started talking about idealism, and how it's not just
AWism.
things circling in your head, and how when people use the term dialectical materialism, they think they're using dialectics for some purpose that Hegel never intended or didn't do, and that's wrong. But We can go on. Are you still recording?
Yeah.
Oh,
I literally
well.
finished the video right now, and I finished.
Damn.
I'm like, I didn't realize that I was DC'd. I noticed that I was DC'd in the video place window. I didn't know I was DC'd here. Goddamn.
No, we didn't hear anything. I just started ranting about Spirit and stuff.
Okay, at what point did in the video do you think was it that
It was about
left off?
13 minutes in.
All right, let's. Seriously, 13 minutes in?
Yeah.
Oh well, that's not too bad.
Yeah, 3 minutes left. Well, if you already made profound proclaimments, that's fine. I didn't really have that much to add about what he was saying anyway.
No, the last thing I was just talking about how he, you know how he ends the video talking about the sublation of the class struggle.
Yeah.
So I was just commenting on it, and then I came back in, and you guys messed me up.
Yeah. Sorry.
Anyways, to finish that off, I was just commenting about how it's just a confused example that he gives. Because if you listen to it, like the last 2 minutes, it's just he both talks about it. He doesn't seem to have clear the difference between like the negative dialectics, the positive dialectics, and the way in which like Marx was pretty much ambivalent his entire life as to just like what he thought it was. You know, whether he really believed there was a real dialectics, you know, whether it was a real metaphysical thing, or whether it was just kind of like some left comms, you know, take it, which is that it's just a peculiarity of like capitalist society, you know, full of contradictions, blah, blah, blah.
Did you say he was ambivalent towards it, or he was ambiguous about it?
Ambivalent towards and ambiguous about it.
Yeah, both, probably.
It's clear, like, he never was clear, like, of what he thought it was. It's clear he never really was sure what it was. Yeah. And he never worked with it in such a way that it was clear whether he thought at the end that it really worked that way, or whether that's just kind of the way it would work for now. And then after communism, you know, it wouldn't happen anymore. So anyways, he was talking about how workers and capitalists get split, you know, they're reconciled in the new social society. And I was saying he's wrong. Because it doesn't make sense. You don't get... He said capitalists are the new oppressed class.
In as much as they're oppressed until they are no longer capitalists or something?
Well, no, that's what I was saying. Like, that can't be true, because if you really have the new society, you know, they can't be capitalists, and they also can't be workers.
Yeah, they're not capitalists anymore.
Because they don't have capital. Yeah. They don't have the means of production anymore. They can't employ labor power, and workers aren't workers because they don't even employ themselves. You know, they just come together as a free association of labor, and they rationally plan production. So that sublation
so you're saying
does not
that
work. So his example doesn't work.
Yeah, it doesn't. But are you saying that the capitalist then becomes the rabble, excluded element in the society, and what place do they have?
No,
are you saying he doesn't account for that?
Yeah, he doesn't account. I'm just saying, like, he mistakes it as, you know, the classes continue under that, even though technically they should not, by its very concept. Because if you have the revolution, well, there is no capital, there is no capitalist anymore. Can't have that. Unless you know you're trying to do this like game of like the transitional period of like, you know, the USSR. In which, you know, then you don't have a change in contradictions. You just have the same contradiction. You know, you can say that the state is the capitalist, and, you know, everybody else is work. And Marx even talks about it in 1844 manuscripts.
Yeah, Finnish Bolshevik always talks about socialism as a transitionary period, like everything that happens before communism, the full final result is the is the transitionary period, you know, and how socialism has exploitation, whereas communism doesn't. That's when we abolished exploitation.
Yeah, but obviously the weird thing is that since that's not a full society in and of itself, and it's either a distorted form, well, not a distorted form, it's just a different form of capitalism, which is true, or it is this weird chimera, which isn't a real society in itself. You know, it's literally just a transitionary form, which isn't a form in and of itself.
It's just some developmental chimera that takes aspects of both and tries to develop communism. They think organically out of it, but it's not an organic thing. What we want is not organic. It's not set to be.
You're damn right it's not organic. We want GMOs. I want genetically modified corn and dogs and hot dogs.
Okay.
Alright, so I'll just stop recording here. That was a response enough.
Yeah.